Welcome to the recorded session, Responding to Vicarious Trauma, Tips for Researchers and Practitioners. It is my pleasure to introduce the presenters, Paula Gomez-Storti and Lisa Teason. Paula is the Senior Director of National Training and Technical Assistance at Casa de Esperanza, an organization focused on supporting Latinos and Latinas and their communities. Lisa is a Senior Partner with Resilience Works. In this session, Paula and Lisa discuss the personal and professional impact of work exposure to trauma, as well as ways to mitigate the impact of this trauma to promote well-being. Don't forget to post any questions you may have in the discussion forum. We hope you enjoy this session. First, we must acknowledge our supporters. This virtual institute is supported by the Office for Victims of Crime and the Office of Justice Programs by the U.S. Department of Justice. Now, I give you Paula and Lisa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Teason with Resilience Works and also with the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. And I'm here with my colleague and collaborator, Paula Gomez-Storti, who is the Senior Director of National Training and Technical Assistance with the National Latino Network, Casa de Esperanza. We have worked for a long time in Boston together, Massachusetts together, and we are really happy to be talking about responding to vicarious trauma today and being part of the CVR Virtual Institute this summer. So thanks, CVR, for having us join you, and I will pass it on to my colleague, Paula.
Thank you, Lisa. It is a pleasure to be working with you today and discussing this important topic with you and with all of our participants. So today our objective is to explore the impact of the work exposure to trauma, examine the personal and professional effects on this exposure, and understand ways to mitigate the negative impact of the work and celebrate benefits of doing this work. Our framework today is vicarious trauma, as Lisa stated, for researchers and practitioners. What does the research tell us? We've done substantial work on this topic and on research on vicarious trauma and resilience, and so we'll be looking at that today. What have our colleagues and clients told us over the decades of this work, and what can be done, because there's lots that can be done. So our hope is that the takeaway today is to explore the impact of the work exposure that can be profound, and that is a reality. There is an impact. This impact has to be acknowledged by our workplaces and our leaders within our fields. Informed consent must be given to do this work, meaning when someone is beginning to do this work, it is important that that person understands the impact that the work may have on them. And individuals and organizations share responsibility on self-care. And so that it's not just the individual, it's also the institution with policies and practices and culture. And absolutely something can be done by both, by individuals and organizations. So I love this quote, why we are here. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it. It is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet.
So thank you, Paula. I think reminding us that we are impacted by the work is really important. And I'm really happy having been part of the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. And as I talk about the definitions right now, I'll be talking about what we learned in the process of developing that toolkit over the past 5 years. And what's exciting about it, just as you said, Paula, both individuals and organizations share responsibility in responding to vicarious trauma. And in fact, the solicitation that initiated the toolkit was the first time that OVC, the Office for Victims of Crime, actually made the request for a toolkit for practitioners, Rather than focusing on victims and survivors, they focused also on the impact of trauma exposure to the workforce, and that was really important. And the other thing that they did in establishing this toolkit of resources for all of you in the field is that they focused on organizational response. And too often, this inevitable occupational challenge is left to be managed by us, by those of us in the field, both practitioners and researchers, when in fact we really believe that organizations bear a responsibility. So to jump back in, work-related exposure to trauma is what we're talking about today. We're using the term vicarious trauma. It is the exposure to trauma, whether it be an acute and large-scale incidents of violence or trauma, or whether it's part of our daily exposure to what we might often call the daily kind of chronic exposure that we experience through the work that we're doing. That's what we're talking about. It's an inevitable challenge, and it also both produces negative but also positive and potentially neutral impacts. And these negative impacts can be prevented, avoided, or managed. And so let me give you the overall flowchart that we developed during the course of developing the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. And again, we're using the term vicarious trauma as the exposure to traumatic experiences at work. And out of that comes the change in worldview, a shift in how we begin to view the world. Those of us who have, through our work, the exposure that we haven't had previously, that may be a whole new reality, that the world isn't safe, that doing this work, we see things that we never thought would happen to people if they were living their lives safely and thoughtfully. You know, that violence does happen and we feel it profoundly in the work. But for those of us who grew up knowing oppression, knowing traumatic events in our home, in our community, in our experience, we already knew the world wasn't necessarily safe, that everything wasn't going to be okay if we tried to keep ourselves protected. And for those of us who have previously experienced trauma, we have a new layer of seeing really the exposure to many, many people. So all of us have a shift as we begin to do this work. What we also see is this spectrum of responses that we call by many, many names, and we'll even throw in a new name today for something. But we see the vicarious traumatization that was first coined by Lori Ann Perlman and her colleagues in the 90s about as part of the negative impact and part of the change of worldview. Also, secondary traumatic stress, another term used constantly beginning also in the late 80s and 90s by Charles Figley and his colleagues. And again, many of these terms are used interchangeably for the negative impacts, both acute and cumulative. What these professionals posited in the 90s, they also posited the positive experience of doing this work, vicarious resilience, vicarious transformation, compassion, satisfaction, but that's gotten less attention. And we really wanted to make sure as we propose these put forward these positive terms, that we would really try to highlight those. And you'll see that throughout our presentation. And then the neutral impact is a hypothesis of ours that when we're doing a good job organizationally and individually, that we can begin to develop a better buffer, if you will, against the negative impacts and strengthen the benefits of doing this work. Vicarious trauma is an occupational hazard, an occupational challenge, and what we believe is that organizations have an ethical mandate or a duty to train, to give informed consent, as Paula mentioned earlier, that we have a responsibility to let people know as they enter this work that that can have a negative impact on their lives and on how they view the world. Exposure to traumatic material comes in many different forms, and we want to highlight that here, especially because we're talking to you practitioners and you researchers, because many times we think about that it's the direct contact that is where we get exposed, and that can happen if you're doing clinical or advocacy work with individuals or groups, but also that it can happen in focus groups or other groups that you are gathering for research purposes. It can happen, this exposure, through talking with a person via phone or chat, through reviewing the wide array of documents that many of us in our jobs are reviewing, details, sometimes photos, as well as narrative, and even in coding data. In some ways, coding data and thinking about the hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals, those of you who are coding, are exposed to, that impact is pretty profound as we step back and think about it. Going to be continuing here with exposure to traumatic material that we've just done. I'm sorry for that. Let me move on to the risk factors that we know are present both personally and professionally here that have been researched, and there's still more to do here. Because, for instance, trauma history, many of us have trauma histories, and it can both be a risk factor for triggering our experience, bringing us back to what has happened to us. But those of us who've experienced traumatic events have also been found to be able to maintain our connections with survivors, those of us working directly with survivors. And for that material, Dr. Slattery and Dr. Goodman have some good research there. But again, the research is being done all of the time, and we want to know that we have both personal risk factors as well as organizational risk factors that need to be paid attention to. We want to highlight, and we will be talking about, talk about that a bit down the road. But again, when we have high impact of both studying and meeting with trauma survivors, that's the core of our work. That really makes a difference. Maybe we're not really matched with our organization in terms of its overall structure or in terms of its mission. Lack of team or project support, not having supervision, not being responded to. We see the isolation, and we'll highlight that in a bit, both personally and professionally, as risk factors. We also wanted to mention the negative impacts, and we're going to be moving quickly into the positive as well, because we don't want to just stay here. But it is important to know that doing this work impacts us, as you clearly know. And as you look at some of these negatives, think about how the work is impacting you. And this is something you might want to bring forward in our discussion forum in early August, that first week of August. But think for yourself a minute. We know we are losing great researchers and practitioners all the time because of the negative impact, that we might be feeling depleted and unable to really connect or work with the people that we need to be talking with and listening to. We may not be as productive. We may actually potentially pose harm to the people we're working with. We may be more decreased in our energy, in our connections, and it's certainly, those of you sitting there reading this know it's had an impact on your relationships, both with colleagues, both with families and partners, friends, community. So pause for a minute and think for yourself, where are those impacts that are feeling most burdensome right now? I'm going to pass it on to Paula to highlight a few of the negative both risk factors and impacts that we think are pretty important.
Thank you, Lisa. I just wanted to respond to what Lisa was saying in that when we're introspective, when we're looking, as Lisa asked, are we, have we caused harm? Are we not engaging with our team? And it's important if the answer is yes in this reflection, not to feel shameful about that, and more as these are indicators, right? These are indicators to have some sort of awareness in our self-care and our maintenance. So sometimes we may feel bad, but we urge you that this is a reflective response and an opportunity to heal and take care of yourself. So one of the impacts is invisibility, the feeling of being invisible. If we're aligning with the survivor, there may be a stigma about the work that we do, or others that are not in this field may not know how to respond to us working with individuals that have experienced harm, or may have their own thoughts and beliefs about the work. There might be fear or not knowing how to talk about this with us, and that may create a sort of isolation. We may not want to talk to our friends or families about our day or about what we read if they don't understand. And so that can also contribute to this isolation and hopelessness. So it underscores the importance of having a team or having individuals outside of your organization that understand the work, and so that they can provide support and undo this invisibility and enhance connection. So the next slide, Lisa, thank you. So a word of isolation is without the support of peers and supervisors, we cannot do the work. This isolation is almost debilitating, and we need to feel supported and present when we are supporting others. We have to be connected with our team and with our supervisors in our community. When we hear stories of trauma and violence, and also we hear and witness and experience oppression, the same oppression that our survivors are expressing, there is an added layer to that impact. And so shared identity compounds the impact when witnessing and or experiencing the same oppression. So in doing research and in supporting survivors, we hear stories of homophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism, and we may have experienced those oppressions as well. There is a layered impact. We can be compassionate, but there's also the identification that we've also experienced that. And so it is important, that has an impact, and it is important then when seeking support to be able to talk about that and express that and the impact it has on us. So some protective factors are higher levels of shared power, experiencing respect and equality within the workplace and within supervision. And so individuals as employees, do we have a say in the culture and the process, in the policies of our organization, in the training, in dialogues? Do we have a say within our supervision? Are we getting supervision? Do we have peer support? Do we have peer support internally and externally? And the validation of personal accomplishments. And that's really part, and we'll talk more about this, vicarious satisfaction, vicarious resilience, and vicarious growth. is the validation that what we are doing day in and day out has an impact on individuals, our community, and our society. And that really is powerful, but it's important that our peers and supervisors and ourselves are able to recognize that in the midst of violence and oppression, we are doing good. Thank you, Lisa. Protective factors, job-specific and trauma training. So it is important to have training within the workplace about trauma, vicarious trauma, and I would include there vicarious resilience. And that when we have training on various aspects of our work, we feel more empowered and more confident, right? And so if we have that information, we have that training, we are now feeling more confident as opposed to not knowing and feeling uncertain about what we're doing, and then having the sense of insecurity. The training helps our sense of resilience because we feel more confident in both trauma and specific to our job. Increase in perceived role competence. Again, the training supports that, and quality supervision. We were mindful to put quality supervision because we may have supervision weekly and we could talk about how our week went and our projects. However, are we able to talk about in supervision how the work or events in the world impact us in doing the work? And so if there is a senseless hate crime that occurred and it is impacting us as we day in, day out hear stories of violence, and that impacts us, are we able to bring that into supervision and to name it and to say, this is impacting me, and what are some things that I can do or we can do in order to cope and heal? An exploration of positive impacts of the work. And I think that this is essential in, as mentioned previously, to have time to talk about the positive impact of the work, that we're not doing this alone, and that individuals across the organization and communities are doing work every single day. Personally, I am fortunate to work in a national organization where sometimes during my personal time, if I'm on social media, I see all these stories of just awful things happening. And yet when I travel and provide technical assistance to rural parts of the U.S., to know there are individuals in community and neighborhoods doing fantastic, creative, wonderful work that is healing, and that gives me hope that someone in Mississippi is doing wonderful work, and I'm here in Boston, and knowing that gives me strength. Did you want to say something, Lisa?
I just resonate with that, Paula, because it's so important that we hear about the great things that are happening. And I feel the same way, meeting with people here in Massachusetts. But as I travel the country involved with other projects, it so buoys my spirit, my commitment to moving this work forward by hearing of the creativity, the commitment, the excitement of other people, so that when I'm feeling maybe a little fatigued, a little down about the work or feeling more hopeless, that I can be reminded of the great things that are happening. So thank you for just underscoring that so much.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, in terms of age, I see seniors that have done this work for 40, 50 years, and so grateful of the work that they had done prior to me being involved. I've been doing this for 25 years. And so there are so many individuals that preceded me that did such hard work, and they're still doing it. They're still doing it. That gives me hope. And then I see youth, right?
Absolutely.
And using social media and having a different perspective. And that gives me hope for the future, and to know that I'm part of it. I'm not alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
So peer support and supervision, as I mentioned, peer support and supervision that understands the impact of trauma as well as oppression contributes to feeling heard, seen, validated, and valued. And so if we come into supervision with the expectation of talking about a client's survivor's progress, and not be able to discuss oppression, or not being able to discuss all aspects of the story, it's not quality supervision or peer support. And so are we able to express that impact in our supervision, both individual and group supervision, and its impact, and the individual receiving that, hearing us, are they able to understand the impact that it has on us? They may not be able to understand the totality of our impact because we have our own lives lived, but that are able to sit with us, right? And to hear that, bear that, and provide us support, validation. And that has a huge impact, that we are seen, and that increases connectivity and breaks that isolation.
Mm-hmm. May I just add something too, Paula?
Yeah.
That, I want to underscore too the steadiness of that supervision and peer support, that people know that they're going to meet with a supervisor on a regular basis, whether it's weekly or every other week or monthly. There's both the accessibility, I need a quick question answered on the fly, but also knowing that I can go sit in a private office and talk to someone about what I need in the work. And knowing that's going to happen at the end of the month, or it's going to happen at the end of the week, really matters. And I think at times when we're caught up in the day-to-day pressures of the work, it's easy to cancel supervision or say I don't have much to talk about, or my supervisor might have a grant they're finishing, or have to, finish a report up. And I think knowing that there is that steady connection and in supervision is also pretty important. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah. Thank you. So self-care, the World Health Organization states that the ability of individuals, families, and communities to promote, maintain health, prevent disease, and cope with illness with or without the support of a healthcare provider. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa for the next slide.
That's great, Paula. Thank you. And let me underscore, it's interesting, when I first began to look at this definition, and they've only recently updated it the past year, and they really, in their earlier definition that they held for many years, really related more specifically to the well-being checklist that Paula provided, because it really spoke to the need of every human being in their environment, in their community, to be able to take care of their basic needs. And what I've often thought about when we think about self-care, and that language is out there, all of us need to be taking care of ourselves as best we can. We need to get enough sleep, to eat enough, to eat as well as we possibly can to nourish our bodies, to stay hydrated, and to get moving, and to be in relationship with others. But what I also think about even more is, how do we sustain ourselves? And I like to use that language because sometimes self-care can either be brushed off as something someone doesn't have time for, or somehow is, just an added kind of icing on the cake. And the World Health Organization, in my mind, brings us back to the importance of these very basic needs that we all have as humans. But then I keep thinking about how much more important it is for those of us who are working in the trauma field, who are exposed to the numbers, the stories, the realities of people living through traumatic events, and how much more we need to be mindful of that self-care and development of sustaining practices. Paula, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah. So and we know in the research of the symptoms of vicarious trauma typically may impact intrusive thoughts or sleeping and eating and so forth. So when I think of responding to the impact or those symptoms is this: how is my sleeping? How is my eating? But also when things seem so overwhelming, and at least you said in terms of like an added on, that self-care sometimes is an added on,
Mhm.
and I feel like there's a disconnect. I have to do this of, okay, am I sleeping 8 hours? And if I'm not, what can I do in order to relax myself an hour or two before I need to go to bed if I'm
Mhm.
waking up tomorrow at 6:30, right?
Right.
And am I eating 3 times? And the one that I have a hard time with is hydration, right?
Mhm.
What are the things that I can do? All those things together make me more resilient, especially sleeping, right?
Absolutely.
Restoring at night.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes I feel I love yoga, but I don't get to yoga as much as I would like to. And I feel that this is something tangible, that when things seem so overwhelming, that I can do this. And if I do this, I'm more likely to take a walk, right? I'm more likely to go to yoga, but I have to go to the basics when I'm really overwhelmed.
I think that's a really good way to be thinking about it, Paula, and is a good reframe for me. This is my vital checklist. And I agree with the sleep. I mean, the research is telling us so much about the way we think, the decisions we make, the ways we physically feel when we get good sleep versus not getting enough. And I hate to lay that on top of people, for instance, who have a new baby at home,
Yeah,
because it's hard to get that
yeah.
sleep, right? But as best we can, given our current circumstances, how can we be intentional about getting to bed in order to optimize the possibility of getting some decent sleep, right?
Yeah.
And I think about the sexual assault responders that I talk to who are taking hotline calls in their apartments, in their homes,
Yeah.
and really encouraging them not to take them in their bedroom if at all possible, and if taking that call on the hotline in their bedroom because they share an apartment, to take that call in a corner or a spot in the room that is out of bed so that we don't mix bed with those crisis calls. You know that if you're out doing crisis work at night, to have a stash of, healthy bars, some water, even though it might not be the coldest, that you've got some decent things to put in your body if you need to, if you're a sane nurse going from hospital to hospital, if you're responding to a traumatic event as a crisis responder for a community violence team. Think about how can you best be prepared in these ways.
And lastly, I just wanted to add, we know that the body remembers what the mind forgets.
Mhm.
And so
Absolutely.
for me, there's tension in my shoulders or in my hips. And I may not go to yoga, but I do those poses and stretch my hips and shoulders. And I can relax more readily when I'm in bed. Or sometimes I've been in bed and I just toss and turn. I just go on the floor
Mm-hmm.
and I stretch. And when I get back in bed, I'm able to relax and fall asleep easier.
Great. You can tell everyone that Paul and I have been in this work for a while. We think a lot about how do we sustain ourselves and how do we help spread the word about how important all of this is. Wherever we are sitting, wherever we are standing, however we're doing this work, that if you sit all day and you're looking at a computer or you're looking at other um, measures or interviews or you're meeting with someone one-on-one, how often do you get up and stretch? Can you get someone from work to go for a walk or have lunch? Think a minute. When was the last time you actually took a lunch break? When was the last time that you got outside for that and didn't run 15 errands, which may be quite satisfying. I don't want to get down on errand running, but can you sit for a minute and pause and just breathe? So I will keep us going, but we will keep reflecting back and forth on all of the ways we have think it's important, and we know from the research that it's important to be doing. So it's interesting. This is a newer term that Paula brought into this presentation, and I think it's great, vicarious growth. We think about post-traumatic growth, and that's something that we've talked about for a while. The research has shown that survivors of traumatic events can experience growth out of that traumatic event. And what we're learning, and this really is maybe a reframe of that, is vicarious growth rather than post-traumatic growth, that we may in fact grow. You know, being resilient is being able to bounce back to ourselves, to our baseline, if you will. And this research speaks to actual growth out of those events one has experienced. And we too, as researchers and practitioners, can also experience that. Some of the ways also, as we think about ways that we can take care of ourselves in the work, and this can be fostered outside of our workplace and inside our workplace. You know, we've learned through the years, many years of research, how important healing of survivors is, how important connection and relationships are in the healing of survivors. And it's that steadiness, it's those people with whom one feels at ease, safe, protected, where you can just be if you need to be, that those healing connections are vital. We also actually know from the research that it's important throughout the lifespan. We know from early research of children who've been traumatized that in fact the healing does occur with that steady, consistent relationship, and across the lifespan, that we live longer and we do better if we are in connection with others. But also, as Paula mentioned earlier, isolation in this work is really harmful. It keeps us from, being able to sometimes get the perspective we need, get the affirmation we need, and sometimes we can get pretty, I'd say, down in a rabbit hole, if you will, about potentially a case, a person with whom we're working, or some case that we're studying, if you will, and the trauma material, the traumatic material that we're reading or we're visualizing with photographs can just really sap us. So if we have someone we can chat with virtually or in person, that we can connect with across our project or our team, that really can make a huge difference in our work and in our lives. There are many places we can go in thinking about what can sustain us, but meaning making is another way that we build our resilience and maintain ourselves in the work. And for many of us, it's finding our place in the movement of this work, our role in the world, in making positive change, in valuing the importance of, say, the domestic violence program that we're involved in, the research study that we're involved with, and also what Paula was speaking to, the creativity we see on the ground throughout the country, and those of you who are doing international work, seeing it around the world, that people heal and that there is capacity for healing, and sometimes we lose sight of that. Is there anything you want to mention about connection or meaning you'd like to speak to, Paula?
No, I think you covered it. Thank you, Lisa.
Okay. I mean, part of this too is being able to be self-reflective, pausing beginning or end of the day or during the day to reflect on that meaning of the work and what is making a difference for you. One tip, one exercise, if you will, or tactic you can use, strategy, comes from our colleagues in Canada at Attend Academy, is this notion of a hot walk and talk. And after you've been reviewing difficult materials or you've heard a difficult story, finding a colleague, grabbing a bottle of water and getting outside or walking wherever you can to kind of talk through the story that you just heard or you just read about. You know, having a partner who can ask you about this, obviously in confidence, obviously not sharing too many details to expose the privileged information that you have, but being able to let go through storytelling and releasing those hormones by drinking the water, by walking briskly, really, and increasingly briskly, can help slough off some of the toxins that can collect in our bodies from those literal stories. And so this hot walk and talk, why hot? Because when we walk briskly, it helps and drink water. It helps to flush out those toxins. And sharing the story can also help us to release what's gathering within our memories. And so thank you to Drs. Francois Matteau and Patricia Fisher for introducing this creative intervention. I want to pass on now to Paula to talk about a little more about some of the positives that come out of doing this work.
Thank you. So compassion, satisfaction is a positive, and the feeling of satisfaction, the feeling of accomplishment, the pleasure that comes out of doing the work and having witnessed a process with a good outcome. And so there's a satisfaction. It could be a survivor supporting another survivor in a support group, or it could be envisioning this program because of the gap of services in your community. And then there's funding and you've accomplished it. And then you see individuals benefiting from that program. That is certainly a compassion satisfaction, that in doing the work, you feel satisfaction. Vicarious transformation, in that you as an individual have connections with others, and there is a transformation in you, as well as you see the transformation in the survivors that we support. There's a transformation in us, in what we witness and what we learn and in what we do, that it impacts also us personally and professionally. That strengthens our resilience when we are able to be mindful of the satisfaction, mindful of our transformation, to have this vicarious resilience. And as we've discussed, resilience is something that we need to be mindful and attend to, and it's ongoing. It's not just once and then we're done. It's ongoing to enhance that resilience in order to do our work. And finally, vicarious growth. And what was interesting about this within the research is individuals, as Lisa mentioned, that have experienced personal trauma can also, by doing the work and seeing the transformation and growth and healing, along with education about the work and education about trauma, combined can spur growth within us. And that is professionally or also personally. And when it's personal, it impacts our relationships and it impacts our communities. And so a vicarious resilience. The research says that the process of learning about overcoming adversity from the trauma survivor in the resulting positive transformation and empowerment through their empathy and interaction. There is a greater perspective and appreciation of our own problems, more optimistic, motivated, efficacious and re-energized, increased sense of hope, understanding, belief in the possibility of recovery, profound sense of commitment to and finding meaning from the work. Vicarious traumatization is addressed in trainings for advocates, but as we mentioned earlier, it is imperative that advocates also be exposed to the information about vicarious resilience, including how to use the rewarding aspects of their work to buffer them against the difficult aspects of helping survivors. So when introducing someone to the work, we typically now are talking about vicarious trauma, but in talking about vicarious trauma, it is important to talk about vicarious resilience, and that that is real, and it is also an impact of doing the work. It's important for external supervisors and or consultant, and maybe like a clinical supervisor, the important resources in helping advocates identify the growth in clients and in positioning these observations as a source of vicarious resilience. So that could happen in supervision when talking about a difficult case, or talking about reading testimony after testimony, is to be able to reflect back on any growth that the survivor has experienced, or strength that the survivor has experienced within that trauma, within that violence, and the positive aspects of hope. Because when we are impacted by hearing about violence and oppression, it is overwhelming. And so it's important that someone that is listening to us reflect back opportunities of strength and growth and hope in transformation. And so, as we've heard, what we pay attention to grows. Bringing conscious attention to resilience and vicarious resilience can strengthen it. So if we think of, if we're mindful, maybe at the end of the day, of what are the positives, of what did I hear that was really meaningful today and that gives me hope. If we focus on that, and not just focus but pay attention, it grows. And not only that, it almost becomes, and I've done this personally as a practice of gratitude. When I began, I was very mindful, intentful of writing my gratitudes. Now it's automatic. It's I'm driving, I'm walking, I'm having a conversation, and it just pops into my mind. Oh my gosh, I'm so grateful for this. Like just this moment, or just that beautiful flower, or just that breeze. I'm so grateful that now it's just automatic. And Lisa's going to talk more about gratitude.
I wanted to highlight, thanks Paula, just what we're learning from neurobiology about how when we are focusing our conscious attention on, for instance, the positive aspects of doing this work, that strengthens the neural connections that around the positive. You know, it's easy to get caught up with the negative. Both can be contagious, the positive or the negative. And you know how it can be in a workplace when everyone's focused on the negative. Similarly, when we're only thinking about all that has happened to someone. But we also know what can happen when we're focused on what has come out of what's happened, or how the survivor has shown strength, resilience. Again, this idea of learning, paying attention to the resilience of the people with whom we're working with, or the groups that you're studying. We see so much resilience every day. And, you know, this is another aspect of that positive psychology research has brought to the field that I think is really helpful for us. And just as Paula was saying, I want to spend a minute just talking about gratitude and the power of practicing gratitude. And I think it's Oprah Winfrey that actually really brought this out even more fully into popular culture with the idea of having a gratitude journal, as Paula was mentioning. And we are also seeing research on this. It started, I think, in California, and you see this referenced here, but that pausing each day to reflect on what has gone well, on what is out in the world that you're grateful for. You know, there are people who've done this for ages and it's part of their living and breathing. But it's also, for some people, it's hard to find the time. And for some people, it's hard to find something good that's happened. And so here too, you will see as you develop this practice that it gets easier. And you will see the amazing benefits that we've listed out here about what putting our thoughts into this framework of focusing on gratitude. We're going to be more alert, more enthusiastic, more energetic. You know, we're more likely to reach out to others. It helps us in our connections. It helps us with our physical health as well. So I can't say enough about pausing each day, whether it's verbally, whether it's in your own head, or whether you're keeping a journal, that it can be really helpful, a helpful practice day to day. We want to take a minute right now as you think about all of the ways that we have been suggesting that you might use to sustain yourselves. We are going to open a poll that will be with you as you are part of this virtual institute, and you'll see our question: what do you do at work that helps you stay engaged and energized? And you know what I'll say is that I work, you could do it in caps, you could do it as you normally would write, but I work with a partner, with a team, with a partner in as much as, and I could spell and talk at the same time. That would be helpful. But I will post work with a partner or with a team because that helps me, what's the word? Not be isolated, as you've heard us repeat multiple times. And it really gets the creative juices flowing sometimes. So that's what I would add. And over time, over the virtual institute and the discussion forum that first week in August, you'll be able to contribute to a word cloud that will be developing on this very question. So thanks for considering participation in this poll. I jumped to the wrong place here, so let me move forward. Sorry, everyone. We have focused this session really on what you can do. And what I would like to spend a few moments on is to think about what can you do as an organization? And this came out of the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. We really looked at the research, looked at clinical practice, and you can't see it as well here as I would like, but we focused on 5 areas as a way to organize the toolkit, and also in our Vicarious Trauma Organizational Readiness Guide, the VT-Org, which is an organizational assessment that you can do in your organization to look at where are you doing well and where could you shore up and develop some more resources for your organization, for your teams, and for the individuals. And the 5 areas are leadership and mission, management and supervision, employee empowerment and work environment, training and professional development, and staff health and wellness. These are areas that Paula and I have touched on in various ways, and I will speak a little bit more about now in this next slide. I pulled out some of these particular areas that correspond with the 5 areas I just mentioned in the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit, but there are many things that organizations can do. that can help them sustain themselves organizationally and as a staff. From the top down and also middle and bottom across, having leadership recognizing that vicarious trauma is real. And while we haven't talked about the prevalence or the reality of this phenomenon as much today, we haven't talked about the research in that area, but we do know that the work exposure impacts everyone. And while those impacts may be different, having leadership recognizing it and not just decide because Paula and I are really depleted after a particular engagement, particular incident and issue with a client or someone we're working with, that somehow we're not fit for the work, that rather that our leadership step back and say, what can this organization do to help Paula and Lisa when we have such cases or such material coming to our organization? So it's leadership recognition. It's paying attention from the beginning, from the interview, from onboarding, and ongoing recognition and training around work-life balance, although I'm loath a little bit to use that term because I'm not sure any of us can fully achieve it, but we can work towards it. Training provided, but also, in addition to trainings and policies and procedures, some examples of which are in the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit, that there is value placed on taking time off. It's not a badge of honor to work 10 hours instead of 8. It's a badge of honor not to take time off. Let's get rid of that culture and really foster the time off, the teamwork, as well as diversifying job tasks. What we've learned through the years, through the literature, is that in fact, having a full diet of traumatic material really puts us at risk for vicarious trauma. So being able not simply to interview someone around trauma, could we interview someone around something else? Can we speak at a job fair or a health fair in addition to our direct client contact or our coding responsibilities? We've talked about the value and critical nature of supervision. Having connections and formal and informal staff gatherings are really important as well. Having a celebration about someone's personal life, or even if a really good, maybe a grant came in that is going to start a new program or keep the organization going, let's have dinner and celebrate that. It builds team and organizational cohesion. Also, really thinking about safety of everyone on site, everyone doing this work, because when we stand with survivors, sometimes we are at risk, so we want to pay attention to that as well. So having policies and procedures that help move this forward, so it doesn't take an individual to lead the charge, but it's actually, there are practices and policies embedded in the organizational manual, but also that there are living practices of staff meetings, of quality supervision, of team projects that really help everyone on site. So I'm going to close with those organizational practices. Paula, do you want to have anything you want to add on the organizational front?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. I wanted to touch upon the issue of cost, the both and. And
Yep.
so as individuals listening to this presentation, we may or may not have a say in our organization's budget. And so that, yes, it's important to allocate funds to support employees' resilience. And also, it could be cost effective. It doesn't have to be expensive to create a culture of supporting staff, of trauma-informed practices, a trauma-informed culture. It doesn't training is important, but it doesn't have to be expensive. There's lots of things, as Lisa just mentioned in the slide, that can happen without it costing anything. Recognition, support, those are things that can happen and create a culture. So yes, it's important to have allocations on your budget, but it doesn't have to be expensive in order to put this forth. In terms of, I wanted to say a little, just very quickly about when we reference self-care today, self-care starts with the word self, right? And so it's important to be aware of ourselves and what are our likes and dislikes and so forth. But to recognize that we transform, that with new experiences we grow, and those practices may change. And so to be mindful that sometimes there are things that we typically do that make us feel better, that may not during a certain time. It's okay to change them because we evolve, that our practices also can evolve. Wanted to say about supervisors. There are organizations where the supervisor is very mindful of trauma-informed practices and provides lots of support and supervision to their direct staff, and sometimes is not receiving it themselves because they're in this middle management. And so it's important to have that support. If not, if we can't have that within our organization, to invest in someone outside the organization, as we mentioned in the slides, but to also model as supervisors, right? And that we could be very supportive, but our supervisees are looking at us. So if we are sending emails at 11 o'clock at night, or if we're not taking lunch, but say, you really should take lunch. So just to be mindful that as supervisors, our self-care is important, and then we need to live it. We need to live it. And then lastly, what Lisa, you said in terms of sometimes it's very difficult to have this balance between work and life. Mm-hmm. And when I've gotten to that point, or when speaking with colleagues and doing trainings about this, is when I get to that point is everything on my list, do I have to be the one doing it? Mm-hmm. Or can others help me? And what can others do for themselves that I'm doing for them that they could do? That helps the balance, but just to be aware, like, am I doing things that others can be doing for themselves? Or do I want to do it because I share, I show love that way? Just to be mindful. Can my community, can my team help out as well? So that's it for me. Thank you, Lisa. It was an absolute pleasure to present with you again today.
Absolutely, Paula. I really, really enjoyed it, and we both hope that this is a session that you find helpful, that we would welcome your participation in the discussion forum, again, August 5th through 9th, and we'll be responding to questions and discussion that come up. I also want to show you that we will also have a Padlet available where you can post any resources that you have found helpful in thinking about these issues of vicarious trauma, vicarious resilience, and sustaining practices. I posted a little earlier these guidelines that were developed by our colleagues in the Sexual Violence Research Initiative in Pretoria, South Africa. And it's a great guidebook for researchers doing this work. It was particularly designed for sexual violence researchers, really sexual and intimate partner violence researchers, and I'm sure those of you doing other research in the trauma field would find it helpful too. Mm-hmm. So please take time to post what you have found helpful that can help continue to move us forward. So again, thank you, Paula. Thank you to the CVR for including us in this virtual institute. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.